leave it here, and happy to enter into a discussion, have questions. And I wanted to thank also the previous speakers, because I found the presentation particularly helpful, and I will look forward to having them and discussing that further.
Thank you very much, and thank you to our three speakers for your very interesting presentations, because as we can see, they trigger many questions that we can already see in the chat. And we will now have more or less half an hour available for questions and answers and discussion. Francesca will moderate the Q&A session. If you would like to take the floor and your question is not already in the chat, you can use the raise hand function, and then once Francesca has given you the floor, you can unmute yourself. But I leave it here to Francesca, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the speakers for very insightful presentations. And thank you also to the participants who I see have been already active in the chat. So please keep the comments coming and raise your hands if you want to make a comment. And I see some hands are already being raised, but before I pass the floor to you, I would like to just direct some of the questions that have come up in the chat to our speakers to give you the opportunity to answer them. I'm going to try to group some of the questions that have arisen. If you think that if you still want the floor, do raise your hand. But one comment, for instance, that I have seen from Julia regarding secondhand clothes, she makes a distinction that of the environmental impact that a secondhand T-shirt has compared to a new T-shirt, and linking that to the question raised by Stefan, where he says it seems there's no clear distinction yet between waste scrap and secondary raw materials or recycled materials. So should we define better the boundaries? I think his question is very pertinent to Julia's point, as there is a real distinction that needs to be made between scrap and repurposed goods or materials. I don't really know who to direct this question to, so I direct it to all of the speakers, and whoever is willing to answer it, please just unmute yourself and take the floor. So I'll start with that question. Perhaps our colleagues, yes, Colette.
I'll have a go at it before I'll turn it on to the rest of the panelists. But yes, I think the question about differentiation and then linking that to the other question, that's a really, really important issue. I think first of all, just in terms of nomenclature, the way that in our report we used secondary raw materials is basically a product that has undergone at least one layer of manufacturing, has then been used and then has been recovered, right? So it's got that additional element of having been recovered for new use in another process, whereas waste and scrap doesn't have that recovery element to it per se, right? So that is where the distinction comes in, and that's also why it's important that, for example, international classification systems that we use when we trade the harmonized system, that in those classifications where members are putting different tariffs on different products, we can actually make this distinction. And right now, as it stands, the HS classification system does not allow us to differentiate between scrap and waste and secondary raw materials, right? Which is a problem, because then you don't know exactly what you're getting into your country. So that is a key issue, this misalignment between what is important for the circular economy and how you know what you trade and how you regulate what you trade through things like tariffs. That is a really, really important issue. There's some discussions right now ongoing at the World Customs Organization, which is responsible for the harmonized system classification system. They already, I believe, made some changes to e-waste and how there's now more, or there will be more differentiation possible. But there's some discussions ongoing on plastics, and who knows if there will be additional discussions there as well. So I think one really important element to better link environmental concerns, particularly relevant to waste and scrap and all these other things, with the trade world is ensuring that there's alignment between those different differentiations. The t-shirt question, yes, I mean, I think that also links to the issue that was mentioned earlier in the chat about the secondhand clothing question. So the point there that I was making, and that also touches upon something that Marlijn was mentioning at the end of her presentation, but it's very much about kind of more generally, what are some of the opportunities and challenges when we look at what the circular economy does, right? And there have been, so here in Geneva, we did some work as well on what developing countries' interests are in the circular economy debate, and it's absolutely right that there aren't these political divisions that you would see a lot, you know, more strongly say in debates about climate change. That's not there, but nevertheless developing countries are concerned about dumping, and a lot of that dumping happens in the secondhand good department. So there were just some considerations raised, and all I mentioned with that is that this is something that some developing countries have considered to be a problem, like Kenya, for example, tried to ban the import of secondhand clothing, as did Rwanda, but that I think only Rwanda went through with it. But that doesn't mean, I'm not suggesting that there is or there isn't, you know, well, it's a lot more complicated to get more into detail in the sector to see whether, in fact, the secondhand clothing sector has a negative impact on a country's economy. But there are just some of these considerations to take into account, and especially on things like secondhand cars, there have been issues relevant to emissions and how having a reliance on the import cars doesn't enable a developing country to actually move up to the next level and ensure that they've got higher emission standards. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts on that.
Thank you very much. I don't know if any of the other speakers want to add anything. Otherwise, there are other questions I can cover. Yeah, thank you. So there's another string of comments and questions by Igor Struif in the chat. And so I'm going to try to resume the different points, but please do raise your hand if you feel I've misrepresented your point here. But I think what he's trying to point at is the responsibility and the burden that actually high-income countries have for the environmental impact, and what sort of policies circular economy can offer to rebalance the trade imbalances that exist at the moment, and the environmental impact that importing dependent countries have. That's how I'm going to resume his question. So perhaps this could be a question for Madeleine. So what sort of policies do you foresee that the EU can take to rebalance its own dependency and also assume its responsibilities on environmental impacts, both within and outside of the EU, given its high dependency on imports?
It's part of what you were recapping, and somehow I don't have access to Q&A, so I can't read the question. Can you just clarify the question? So policies to rebalance dependency in the sense of imports of raw materials needed for environmental friendly technologies? Is that the question? And
well, the question, sorry, yeah, the question is more about how the EU, being an import-dependent country, has a high environmental impact globally. And the measures that have been raised both by you and in the previous presentation regard more how the EU relates with third countries, but really it boils down to lifestyles in Europe and in high-income countries. So what can we do regarding our own dependency and our own environmental impact abroad to rebalance this structural trade imbalance?
Okay, so thank you very much. I mean, I think at least what we try to do in the trade policy review is really be part of that overall EU objective. And I would redirect us to the Green Deal, where a lot of this complexity is reflected, and maybe what we add in the trade policy review is also a bit. I mean, yes, the EU is a big player, but it's not without limits. If you look at where growth will come from in the coming decades, it's 85% of global growth will come outside Europe. So from that perspective, if you look at trade policy, where there's always an assumption that we have the leverage and we can fix it all, it's not only by having leverage, because that's not what there is. So what we try to do in trade policy is to use all tools. In the WTO, as I explained, what we're trying to achieve through our FTAs, but also autonomous measures. So where needed, we need to address autonomous measures, and quite a number of them do have outreach beyond the EU. If you require from companies to exercise due diligence throughout their supply chain, that supply chain often is in a third country. That is an important development that you will see. We're working now on the deforestation legislation, but there are numerous EU Green Deal measures that try to address these questions. Of course, these things need to happen in a way that's compatible with the WTO. If we do these type of autonomous measures, they need to be non-discriminatory, and they should not serve protectionism, but they should serve a global environmental or climate objective. The other thing that we very much try to do through our FTAs and in our international engagement is indeed working on lifting all of us up to the same goals. After all, one of the messages, for example, we give on CBAM is, if everybody had the similar level of ambition, we wouldn't need CBAM. Likewise, for due diligence, we will be asking from EU companies to have a mandatory obligation to comply with due diligence requirements that should be based on international standards. So from that perspective, it's not only EU companies who need to do that. The only difference is that the international standards are voluntary. If you look at the OECD guidelines and ILO guidelines, they are voluntary. But with that, we are also looking at how we make sure that throughout supply chains we see sustainability. Maybe final note on this, I think cooperation is important. What I noted throughout the COVID crisis, we've been particularly busy with supply chains and the vulnerability of it. And what we've seen is actually that companies, and OECD also has several studies, come to the conclusion that companies that have embraced sustainability as part of their long-term strategy have come out better of the crisis. So it makes sense, even from an economic point of view. And I think that is an important push for it. We see also an increasing interest in third countries, partner countries, to know what it is and to be able to comply with these standards, because they know they want to export to or some know they want to export to the EU. And as a final point, what we've also seen over the last years changing a lot is the conditions that financial institutions are putting on loans. This is a recurring element we hear also from developing countries, that it's not that only we are green, they are also green, and it is in their interest, and financial institutions also make often these linkages to loans only for sustainable projects. So I don't know, I mean, it is not a one-size-fits-all answer, but I think you need to put together all these international, unilateral and bilateral tools.
Thank you. And I'm going to take another question from the chat, and then I'll give the floor to Shunta Yamaguchi, who has raised her hand. But one question that I find quite interesting, and it's quite, let's say, practical, related to let's say a real situation, and that is, how does the Mercosur deal apply with the objective of the EU's trade policy? In the trade policy, I think the Mercosur is expressly mentioned, but as we see the deal going now, we don't really see that words match reality. So how is the EU going about that now that the trade policy is out?
mean, this is a fairly general question, so I don't know whether there's a specific sub-item. But we believe that the Mercosur deal is not only balanced, but does take up on numerous environmental and sustainability issues. We have the TSD chapters, like we have in other agreements. So we have an additional tool to work with Mercosur, which we don't have at this moment. And with that, we lock in all the multilateral environment agreements, but also have all the other chapters that are also relevant for environment. In addition, we are at this moment talking with Mercosur on deforestation and looking at how to best complement that. And as you know, in parallel, and this is also the philosophy reflected in the trade policy communication, in parallel, we are working on an EU piece of legislation on deforestation, which will be an important complement to reinforcing the Mercosur deal. Likewise, there will be also another set of EU measures coming out that are also relevant for us in the context of the Mercosur deal.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to Shunta, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you very much, organizers, for organizing this great event. I'd like to make one comment and two questions. The first comment is that it's really nice that the circular economy thinking has extended to trade. And in the beginning, I think the circular economy has really been a focus, rather having a domestic angle, for instance, building on the proximity principle or industrial symbiosis within your close regions. But then it's really nice that the trade angle is becoming more clearer now. It's very much linked to our thinking around trade and circular economy, where we do see interlinkages between supply chains, end-of-life value chains, and services trade. In order for trade to work for the circular economy, I really think that transparency and traceability is key in distinguishing the trade that we want to work for the circular economy and the trade that we do not want, and having a distinction there is where the challenge really lies. We also had several reports at the OECD that were released on policy alignment, building on modeling work, and also a workshop that we organized. And we'll be summarizing these findings in a webinar that we will be organizing next week on 25th of March, and I'll share this in the chat box. Let me turn to the two questions. First is that to Christina from UNEP. And I fully agree that the circular economy thinking needs to extend to supply chains and the extractive sector. Especially, you really highlighted well that they're interlinked with material footprint, and the impacts at the source is very large. And my question is that in the context of UNEA, you have this mineral resource governance resolution, and I was wondering how that is being followed up and being tied with the circular economy and trade and the extracting sector thinking. My other question is to Madeleine from DG Trade, and this is around the issue of standards and regulations that Colette raised a bit earlier. And around the circular economy, I think there are a lot of standard regulations and standards that are emerging very quickly. As an example, in extended producer responsibility, the thinking now is provide incentives towards eco-design. So this will be towards thinking towards modulated fees. So that would be based on the material content, the recycled content they contain, or the hazardous content that they should not contain. and that would be related to some kind of standards. Circular economy, advancing them would also be thinking around eco-labeling schemes or a green government procurement, and that would also refer to some kind of standards. When you talk to the businesses, businesses do not operate within borders, they're international. So they're very concerned of the fragmentation of different standards and regulations in this area. And if there are any way of harmonizing them, having mutual recognition or equivalence. And my question is, was this any kind of thinking in the EU trade policy reviews? And is there any further thinking around this area? Thank you very much.
So shall I answer the question on the resource governance resolution? Yes. So yes, in February 2019, at the fourth session of the UN Environment Assembly, UNEA, there was a resolution number 19 on the topic of mineral resource governance. And that requested, specifically a part of that resolution requested UNEP alongside some other relevant UN entities and stakeholders to collect information on sustainable practices, identify knowledge gaps and options for implementation strategies, and undertake this overview of existing assessments and initiatives as they relate to governance of mineral resources, so metals and minerals, and then to report back at UNEA 5, the fifth session. And in fact, so what happened is that, and I'm talking from the perspective of the request to UNEP, is that a year-long consultation process was undertaken, including regional consultations and global consultations. I think more than 1,000 people, like stakeholders, were involved and consulted. And so then there is a summary of that, of the findings of those consultations and the key topics and issues and governance initiatives that came up. And that was reported in a document that's publicly available at the fifth session that happened this February 2021. And there will be some follow-up work for the next, for the UNEA 5 Part 2, which will take place in February 2022. And I think the idea there is to have a potentially another resolution on the topic, maybe, or some further decision, and to set up some intergovernmental expert body to continue working on this topic. Now, as it relates specifically to issues of circular economy trade, well, I mean, the resolution on mineral resource governance, for example, takes into account, notes this, some other work of the International Resource Panel, specifically on mineral resource governance. And I think there, a lot of the findings are that, you know, so you do, of course, need, if you look at the projections, you do need a transition towards projections for material resource use. You do need this transition towards circular economy. And but even with that transition and the adoption of circular economy policies and resource efficiency policies, you know, the trajectory will still be, it will dent the growth in resource extraction, but it will still continue to rise. And at the same time, that you have to also look at the implications that, you know, this dent in global demand would have on resource dependent developing countries, because that does mean a loss of export earnings for these low income resource dependent countries. And, you know, this creates a need and an incentive for them to diversify their economy. And in some cases, it will require implementation of appropriate compensation, adjustment measures for the parts of the population that are most affected. And, you know, the global level, at a minimum, that would require some capacity building, development assistance, affording them sufficient policy space, you know, even things like the WTO's aid for trade. But there are opportunities in terms of jobs, and these countries can definitely diversify into emerging sectors relating to the circular economy, be it recycling or manufacturing, refurbishment, renewables. sustainable agriculture, waste management, etc. I don't know if that's answered your question, but from the perspective of UNEP, yeah.
Thank you for that. I now give the floor to Stefan Arditi.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you all for joining the webinar today. I've got a question mostly to the European Commission, but I'm really interested by any other thought on this. One thing which I'd like to know is, how is it feasible to apply due diligence criteria on product and service which are actually traded? So that means we hear a lot about due diligence criteria being labor condition, child labor, but how can we track that back to the product and service that will be traded, so that we are sure that, for example, a product is respecting this due diligence standard? It's a real question. I have absolutely no idea how we could make it practical. Thank you.
Perhaps I would direct that first maybe to Madeleine, as you raised due diligence. Other speakers have ideas afterwards. Thank you.
So, I mean, in principle, due diligence requirements are directed to behavior, in the sense that what a company is required to do is to do its best to make sure that its risk management procedures are in place, to validate that that in its supply chain it will not face, and then it depends on our objectives. We are looking at the legislation that covers human rights, labor, and environmental protection. And then if you look at the OECD guidelines, the ILO has the M&E guidelines, mostly about labor issues, and then the OECD cover both labor and environment. So the company is not is required to doesn't have an end result, if you want, related to the product, but must have its practices in place. That doesn't happen. Now, of course, in the moment you are in forced labor is now a good discussion. Imagine that there is, it's absolutely clear, and there are lots of reports about human rights problems in relation to a certain product or products or a certain region. That should alert a company to say, I need to have my due diligence. I should be aware that there is a problem with this product, so I must make sure that my due diligence practices are there. And I think if you look at those requirements, that at some point, if it is absolutely obvious that from one region something is produced in violation with the principles that you've set out, probably we cannot exclude that the only choice you have is to discontinue that. If you cannot secure that you don't have that. So it's not a product requirement. For that you need a different type of regulation. So you will often see that due diligence goes in combination with something, or the moment you have, if you look, for example, at our conflict mineral regulation, you have a regulation that has identified a couple of products as risk. We are issuing, or not we, independent reports are being issued about risk countries. Doesn't say that that country by definition is violating certain, or the companies are by definition not exercising their due diligence. But what it means is that if the countries that have been identified as high risk countries, if you want to purchase products from that region, you need to be very alert with in your due diligence procedures. That out of that schemes emerge, that is a good thing, and I guess that the tighter due diligence obligations are, that the more companies will require, can I have clearer guidelines, can I have clearer criteria? I have a set of practices, audit practices and others that I'm exercising. Can these be recognized as presumed to comply with due diligence obligations. So it's not, I don't think we should confuse it, but the things come together, and in relation to products that are a problem, you will rather get into the zones of high-risk products than saying that that product has evidence of having a due diligence and therefore is subject to an import ban. For that, you need a different type of legislation or complementary. I hope that that more or less answers the question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madeleine, and apologies, but I forgot to remind the speakers that there was a second question by Shunta about the fragmentations of standards and regulations and how that may be a problem for businesses. I don't know whether Colette or Madeleine would like to answer that question.
I think it was addressed to Madeleine, so perhaps she can go first. Maybe I'll share a few thoughts about it.
No, look, I mean, we're in the middle of the Green Deal, I think. It's true that what is unique is that there is an enormous amount of initiatives from different levels, types of legislation. So coherence will be very important. As Commission service, we are not only DG Trade is looking at that, and the typical things DG Trade will look at is it compatible with the WTO? Are we coherent among initiatives? No unnecessary burden. Is it proportional? And the sort of TBT type of requirements. So we are certainly looking into that. But there will be an additional burden on business resulting from the Green Deal. I think that's a given. If we want to, if we're committed to pursue our environmental objectives, you need to organize the transformation of your economy in one or another way. But it's I mean we have this is something of our day-to-day work. It's not that that's particularly the only thing that we've looked at in the trade policy review. It is important that that we have a coherence in our approaches and do not create unnecessary burden. That will be an art because of the multiple set of measures coming out, but we're looking into these things.
If I can just add to that, so I think exactly. I mean, there is, as we mentioned in the presentation earlier as well, with standards proliferation, there's some significant challenges that we shouldn't overlook. And there, I think, as Madeleine just mentioned, I mean, the approach of alignment is really important. And here, going back a little bit to the developing country discussion, I mean, this is a different part of the trade policy, but as I'm sure you'll know, under the generalized system of preferences under the EU, developing countries with different development statuses can obtain duty-free access into the EU market. And so there is that on the one hand to proliferate, to enhance trade with developing countries. And there is, on the other hand, this proliferation of these standards. So there is a bit of a, I mean, tension, if you will, between some of this, because sometimes it could mean that the higher, the more stringent some of these standards, the more difficult it might be for, say, for example, I don't know, Bangladesh to export garment pieces into the EU market. So I think a lot of work needs to be done in aligning these different discussions that seem to be taking place in a quite siloed manner. You know, there's a discussion on preferences, and then there's a discussion on environment or circular economy. So there, in light of this coherence, I think there could be some steps taken, and then with the capacity building as well. But I also think it's important in this discussion of a proliferation of standards and things like that, to not overlook the regional dimension. So especially when we're talking about developing countries, I mean, you've got the African Continental Free Trade Area that has that was launched the 1st of January, and they've got a technical barriers to trade chapter in their, you know, what's so far been negotiated, and there they're highlighting not only international standard bodies like ISO, but also regional standard setting bodies like the African Standard Setting Organization. And so if you think about, I mean, if there were an African country that wants to develop a recycling market or a hub, then a lot of the trade will likely happen with other African countries, right? In particular, say, inputs for a recycling plant. And so to ensure that these standards in those regional elements aren't becoming a problem to advance some elements of the circular economy agenda, I think the regional dimension is really key as well. and then special different capacity building, technical assistance, and all these other things.
If I can add there, thank you for that. No, evidently, we are very keen to align and base ourselves on international standards. Obviously, the challenge is that we don't have for everything international standards. But from our perspective, it will be very important. That should not refrain us from developing, but always in mind that we base ourselves on international context and objectives. And that we intensify also our efforts to engage internationally to develop these where they are not there. That's one. The second is, I think you touched on a very important point. We do care about developing countries and their dimension. In the WTO, I regularly hear, we always give an update of the Green Deal. And there is a call for taking into account also developing countries and the abilities of their SMEs to comply. In our internal work, we have DG INFPA who's fully involved. There's an entire directorate looking after green. The Green Deal is one of the big priorities in the way we're looking ahead and how to engage with partner countries in a way that they can also keep up and keep exporting to us. So that we help them abiding by the environmental standards.
Thank you very much. And we've come to a point where we have to close the Q&A, but it's been a very interesting discussion, and there are other questions in the chat that haven't been addressed. But that's not the end of the discussion, because you can continue to ask questions and put your comments on LinkedIn and on the platform. So I invite you to continue this conversation, always online, but written and not spoken. And so with this, I'll just give a very brief summary and concluding remarks on my part before handing over again to Sophie. So throughout this morning, we have heard some proposals from our speakers and our audience about bringing in circularity into our trade policies and how to remodel our trade relations with global partners. We've heard about how trade agreements can regulate circular economy related inputs, how trade can leverage of trade agreements, the range of unilateral measures that the EU can and should take to assume its own responsibilities, for instance, through due diligence, and also the importance to have clear rules and distinctions between waste and secondary raw materials. The existential threats that we're facing require deepened collective action and cooperation within the international community, including through enhanced bilateral and multilateral efforts. And no country can be expected to resolve the environmental pressures and find solutions on their own. But the one thing that stood out for me today, and that I would like to stress in these final words, is the following fact that was raised by our first couple of speakers. And that is that if trade policies do not try to address the need to reduce resource use, at our current trend, global material use will more than double by 2060. And this is simply untenable for our planet, just looking at the current extreme stresses it is already under. So if this is not a wake-up call to policy and decision makers, businesses, whether they be big or small, and to people, to take action and do something about it now effectively, then I actually don't know what else could be. So with the stresses we are faced today, with biodiversity loss, water stress, and climate crisis, we must not only stop the current trend, but we have to try to reverse it. And with this, I thank you all for your participation, and with a special thanks to our speakers, as well as our co-organizers and hosts, who have allowed us to air some of these thoughts and how we can practically go about remodeling the EU's trade policies and trade practices more widely, so that our economies stop being powered by environmental destruction. Thank you very much again, and Sophie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Francesca. When we were organizing this circular talk, we saw this webinar as one step in a longer process of interesting discussions on trade, resource extraction, and circular economy. We hope that today's discussion will inspire policy debates both within and outside of the EU. A next step in the very near future is a Green Talks Live event organized by the OECD on international trade and circular economy, which will take place on the 25th of March. And Shunta already shared the link to the event in the chat because registrations are still open. So that's next week, another interesting event that will dig deeper into the results of OECD work. In case you know of other interesting events about this topic, please do share them in the chat so that all participants are aware. And before we close this EU Circular Talk, let me draw your attention to how we plan to continue the talk through the European Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform. We have a dedicated discussion forum and we have a LinkedIn group where we will continue the online discussion. So please feel free to join and share your thoughts there. The links to these fora will be shared in the chat. By the end of April, we will share an output document on the website of the European Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform, which summarizes the policy recommendations from the UNEP IRP report, today's discussion and the online discussion, and some important next steps. Something that was also asked in the chat, we will share the slides with you through the website. I would like to thank all our speakers of today for your very interesting presentations that triggered a debate. I would like to thank the colleagues at the EEB, Francesca Carlson, Stefan Arditi, and Tricia Pacifico for co-hosting this. And of course, I would like to thank Alice Sanga from EESC for all the support along this process.